Hey friends, I'm Greg Nettle, and I have the absolute privilege of serving as president of Stadia Church Planting, where our vision is for every child on the planet to have a church. We're going to do that by helping you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches intentionally and strategically, going after the next generation. Thanks for joining us on the Church Planting Podcast. An amazing guest today, Kadi Cole. Kadi Cole has spent the last 25 years serving in local church ministry as an executive director at one of America's largest and fastest growing multi-site churches, a director at Leadership Network, and a founding member of the Women's Executive Pastor Network. She's an author. She's authored Sticky Note Leadership, also her best-selling book, Developing Female Leaders, and her latest book, Find Your Leadership Voice in 90 Days. She speaks at leadership conferences around the world. So excited to have Kadi Cole on the Church Planting Podcast. Well, this is an amazing episode of the Church Planting Podcast. I'm so delighted to have friend of Stadia and my new friend, Kadi Cole, on the Church Planting Podcast. Welcome, Kadi.
Thank you, Greg, so much. It's really an honor to be with you today.
Kadi, I actually read your book, Developing Female Leaders. You have a brand new one out right now, Find Your Leadership Voice in 90 Days. You're just kind of a guru on leadership in general, but I want to go back. Let's just start kind of going back towards the beginning. How was your own personal leadership developed? Did people pour into you? Were there barriers? What was going on with all of that?
Sure. Well, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, I probably had leadership in me, that I didn't know about or wasn't aware of. But for me, I gave my heart to the Lord after my 8th grade year going into high school, mostly because I had sufficiently eliminated all of my friendships and was very lonely and completely scared to go into high school all by myself. And I'm like, maybe Jesus can help me.
Yes.
But with that, at the same time, I think a big part of my salvation story is just moving from a place of being very self-protective to a place of wanting to serve people. I grew up in the church. I started attending when I was in the 2nd grade with my family. And this idea of being a servant, of caring about the least of these, that was a really big mind shift for me in my coming to faith. And so I went into high school going, how do I serve people? How can I be friends to people? I want to try to do this Jesus's way and see if my life gets better. And of course it did. I sat at the really defunct table in the cafeteria. I ran, the mile race with the fattest girl in the class. And I just tried to orient myself around what I thought was the way Jesus would go through life in high school. And in the process, I found my leadership legs because I joined a service organization. I joined some faith-based organizations. If there was an opening of something that needed to be done in the band, I volunteered to do it. And so I didn't realize I was really getting a lot of great leadership training in that. I was really just trying to serve the needs in front of me. And as I went through high school, then those opportunities kind of got greater and greater. I went to college. I did student development. I served in student government. And again, for me, I wasn't trying to be some big leader. I didn't have language around that. I didn't aspire to that. I really did just want to serve. And so God really honored that and blessed that. So I was
Okay, let
leadership.
me unpack that a little bit just a minute. You've given us, oh my goodness, so much already. Okay. So, I'm just thinking principles here. Your attitude of, becoming a leader, you didn't start from the point of, oh, I want to be a leader for Jesus. You started from looking at it and saying, I want to live like Jesus lived and serve like Jesus served. Now, that's an incredible lesson. We could camp on that all day, right?
Absolutely. In fact, I tell people, I'm like, we all have to remember, as much as I love leadership and as much as I spend a lot of time training people on it and helping people navigate it, Jesus never calls us to be leaders. He calls us all to be servants. Leadership is a gift. It's an opportunity. There are seasons of leadership, but servanthood is for life. And so if we work on servanthood, the leadership will often take care of itself.
Okay, so you move into college, student government. Are people starting to recognize your leadership at that point around you?
I think so. Again, I don't know that anyone used that language with me, and that's one of the challenges of growing up. I'm a Gen Xer, so this was, the late 80s, early to mid 90s is when I kind of came of age in young adulthood, and we didn't have a lot of language around that. It was before leadership really hit the scene, especially in the church world. And so I knew that I was reliable. I knew I was trustworthy. I knew I got opportunity. I think people saw someone who worked hard and was productive, and I was trying to be faithful to that. Again, from like a character standpoint, probably. And that's one of the challenges I think for women is the word leadership isn't used very often. So it probably wasn't even really until I hit maybe my late 30s where I was like, I actually myself might be a really great leader. Now, granted, I had a master's degree in leadership. I was leading at high levels, but it was hard for me to get my head around it. I kind of always just assumed I was filling a need for the moment, or that I was working hard to try and keep up with everybody else. I didn't consider myself a strong leader, especially in the framework of leadership I grew up in. So yeah, so I think I got opportunities. I think other people would uh, think of me that way, but I don't think it was communicated, and I certainly didn't talk about or describe myself as that.
Okay, before we leave your younger years, give us the kind of the landscape of the church you grew up in. Was it empowering of women in leadership? Were there ceilings for women in leadership? What was that territory like?
I grew up in a wonderful church in Montana. I grew up in the mountains of Montana. It was about 100 people ish, and still is. Amazing at growing up leaders, though, has launched a lot of missionaries and church planters from that community. So it was a fantastic place for me to grow up, but it was very conservative. And a ton of women volunteered and served in the church, but women really didn't lead or hold leadership positions. And we certainly didn't see a lot of women leading. And so I didn't realize how much that affected my mentality around women
Yeah.
and leadership. And why I think it was hard for me to even like think of myself in those ways, especially because I was very oriented towards obeying God, honoring God, doing things God's way, and knowing that would be different than the world's way. I really looked to my church environments as a place to help me kind of give a picture of that. I say that we grew up in what I call a skip to verse 12 church. So like we'd read the passage of scripture, we were going to have the message, and we'd read like 1 through 3. Now let's skip to verse 12. And but somewhere between like verse 3 and verse 12, there were all these women in the Bible. And when I got to college, I'll describe it in a second. It's a very different scene, but I had a woman challenge me, a person who was discipling me, challenge me to read through the whole Bible in the year. And I was like, there are so many women in the Bible. I had no idea. When I was growing up, I had only heard of 2 sermons with women, and I felt like these were kind of the 2 options for us. I could either be a mom or a prostitute. That was
Oh,
like my understanding of women in scripture. Those were the only messages I ever heard. And so to kind of have my eyes open, I went to a Lutheran college, which ordained women. They were leading in churches. It was a much more egalitarian environment. It was in Seattle, so it was much more progressive just culturally than where I grew up in Montana. And so a lot of those opportunities and things kind of opened up. I ended up majoring in nursing because I thought I would do foreign mission work because I was single and a Christian girl, and that's all I thought I could do. But even in nursing was such a great professional environment to grow up in for someone like me because I was surrounded by incredibly strong female leaders. It's a female dominant industry. And these are like very smart women, very scientific left brain women. I worked with a lot of military based women. So they grew up in the military professionally and now were serving or teaching or were my mentors in hospitals. I worked in the VA system, which had a lot of post military female leaders. So I just had a very early induction into what female leadership could look like and should look like, and how productive that was, and how strong that was, and how valuable that was. Very different than my church bringing. I didn't even realize I was getting this whole other view of feminine leadership. But as a young adult in my 20s, to have that kind of enculturated into my professional skill sets really set me up to do a lot of leadership that I don't think I ever would have aspired or thought of myself being capable of doing if I had not seen it.
okay. So you see this leadership now. You're graduated from college. What are your next steps?
I was on scholarship from the VA, so when I graduated, I had to work at a VA hospital, and that's how I ended up in South Florida, where I still live now. I went to work at a VA hospital. I worked in actually inpatient psychiatric unit, which
Wow.
turns out now very difficult job, but very great training for ministry. And so I did that for several years. I ended up getting recruited to the Christian college in our town, a university. And so I ran the counseling center, or excuse me, the health center, started a counseling center, eventually became dean of students, picked up a master's degree. And so had a wonderful run at the university. And at that time, my church was growing really rapidly. Now, I grew up in a church where no one got paid, including the founding pastor. I didn't know that you get paid to be in ministry. I didn't
Wow.
know there were jobs or careers in ministry. It never dawned on me that I might have a role in ministry one day. I loved God. I loved the local church because of my experience. I was a super volunteer. And my church asked me to come on staff and help them architect this fast growing, fast scaling organization. And I was like, well, we were already at like 3,000 people, the largest church I had ever heard of in my life. I'm like, this is a church of biblical proportions. How much bigger can it get?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I came on staff. I thought I'd be on the church staff maybe 1 or 2 years and then transition back into nursing. And I ended up staying 16 years and kind of grew in leadership with the church. I started off as the a special assistant to the executive pastor, which is really, they didn't know what to title women. And so I took a guy's job who was some associate pastor, and that's the title they gave me. But by the time I left, we had 23,000 people on weekend attendance, plus a
Oh, my
humongous
heavens.
online campus. I helped oversee all of our 9 campuses, and I ran our school of leadership. And I served as the executive director over multi-site.
And I'm trusting you were paid at that point.
At that point, I did get a paycheck, yes. And learned all about what it means to be in ministry and all the different ways that pay and benefits and housing allowance and all those things work, especially when you're one of the only women. And the first one to kind of break through those things we had to learn as an organization. Gosh, how easy it is to underpay women just because we don't think of them in certain boxes.
Yeah, Katie, I in a previous podcast, I actually had my wife on, on the podcast with me, and had to repent and ask my wife's forgiveness because I remember when she was hired. River Tree had multi campuses. She was the worship leader at the big campus over all the multi sites, and I'll never forget when we hired her. Some of the discussion at the executive level was, well, we can pay her less because Greg's the senior pastor. And that was the mindset, and unfortunately is still the mindset in many areas of leadership today, which man, we have to really wrestle with. Is that sinful? And is it ethical? And all of those challenging questions that we need to be asking.
Yeah, they're important questions. I when I did research for the book, one of the biggest aha moments for me is how many biases I have had against women or against myself in leadership. And so I grew up going to all the same conferences, reading all the same books as my male peer counterparts. I understand why we do things the way we do, but it's not right to do it. And so we have to challenge those assumptions. We think of women as like being able to work part-time or for less because their husband's the breadwinner. Like there's just a lot of ways that we go into these conversations and decisions which are really unfair and unethical. And really, the church should be the place that is the best at this.
So,
And but I have no judgment because I was so much a part of those systems and learning all of those bad practices. But I do want to champion all of us getting better at it.
Katie, one of the interesting things, if we think about the theology of this, you said the church you grew up in was very conservative, and so X. And that's the church I grew up into. And I'll just say the same thing you said. Fantastic church. I am so grateful to God. I had that little local church across the street from my house, where I gave my life to Jesus as well. And we would go, yes, and they were conservative theologically. The strange thing for me these days is I consider myself, and I consider Stadia church planting very conservative theologically. But I am very gift-based, not gender-based in the empowerment. And I think there's a reframing we need to do, that empowerment of women in leadership, and I believe recognizing the biblical trajectory of Scripture. For me, that's a very conservative theological position to hold. And when we say, oh, well, if you're egalitarian, you're conservative, if you're complementarian, you're conservative, and if you're egalitarian, you're liberal, I think we're doing a great disservice to our understanding of biblical theology. And so I just wanted to say that for our listeners, that it's a dangerous thing to put people into conservative or liberal camps based on their view of the role of women,
Mm.
because I think you and I both arrived the same way by studying scripture, understanding theologically, and coming out and saying, we believe the Bible teaches in gift-based ministry, not gender-based. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge in this issue, first of all, it is a very big issue. A lot of people who love God and really love and know the Bible disagree about this. So it's
Yes,
a
yes,
secondary theological issue. I'd like to say we are all going to get to heaven and half of us are going to be surprised. I'm not sure which half, the jury's out on that. I don't really care about that, to be really honest. I actually want people to know what their theology is and then live it out. And
correct.
so the challenge is, when we think of it, as you're alluding to, that it's a binary choice. I'm either like for women or against women. I'm progressive or I'm conservative. A lot of these terms, even complementarian, that hasn't even been around for very long, but a few decades. And so, a lot of this conversation is had based on what we grew up with or what we were taught, and many of us like hold to the truths that we were taught, and that's fine. I think what's important is that all of us, wherever you're at on the theological spectrum, we all have room to grow in this area. When we did
Yes,
research for the book, we found conservative, complementarian, very outright complementarian churches who had women leading at all levels of their organization, including the executive team. And we found very progressive or egalitarian churches that had almost no women leading in any formal leadership roles.
right.
And theologically, they would welcome women to lead all the way up to elder and senior pastor. So sometimes the thing that we think is the thing is not really the thing. And that's been my thing. I'm not a theologian. I am a leadership expert, and I am just challenging all of us that we are wasting much of our leadership talent by accidentally sending messages or creating structures and systems that are preventing women from using the gifts that God chose to give them. We didn't choose our own giftings. God chose to give it to them. And we are supposed to access them in the local church. That's part of our job as stewarding a flock of people. You'll know if you're not doing a great job at that if you have really high capacity women doing great things outside your church. They're starting their own businesses. They're running their own nonprofits. They're going back to seminary and you didn't know it. They are saying, I have something in me. God has gifted me and called me to make an impact, and I must do it. And if I can't do it here, I will find a way to lead, because that's what leaders
Okay,
do.
well, let's make a shift then and talk more specifically, for all of us. And again, regardless of where you are on the spectrum of your theological understanding, what are some ways that we can help develop female leaders in our context and within our context, right? Whatever it is.
hmm Yeah, one of the key things is to take a look around and see how are we talking about opportunities for people to lead? Are we including and making sure that we're letting women know that we would want them to lead in spaces, particularly in areas that you might not have a lot of women leaders? So, for example, let's just say you are fine with women leading small groups. When we get up and talk about, hey, we're looking for small group leaders, or we're tapping people on the shoulder, are we having those conversations with women? Are we getting up and saying, hey, we have small group leader applications are open. We're going to have a training meeting on Sunday night. If you're interested in leading a small group and multiplying your faith and, shepherding other people and helping them grow in their faith, please come. We want men and women to come and be a part of this. We would welcome men and women into this role, because the challenge is many of us who are sort of those more mature, seasoned leaders, women that you would want leading a small group, right? You don't want some 19-year-old who just got saved last year or someone who's been at the church for 3 weeks. You're looking for people like me, people who have been Christians a long time. I know my Bible. I love God. My faith has been tested. I love you as my leader. I love our church. I'm articulate. I can carry that out. That's who you want leading a small group. But I've grown up in an era where I was mostly told with a very loud vengeance that I am not welcome to lead in certain areas. Now, most of the churches I work with fall somewhere along we want women to lead in a lot of areas, but not senior pastor or elder, or
That's
maybe
correct.
not these top level, or maybe we won't give you title pastor, we'll call you director. I'm like, I don't care. Most women don't care. But those would be like the limiters. That's like 2% of the jobs that are open for people to lead in a church. So, but the volume on those 2% have been so loud and so consistent. I actually have grown up thinking I'm not allowed to lead anywhere. Now, so when you get up and you say small group leader and you use this word leader, I'm automatically taking myself out of the running because I assume you don't mean women unless you explicitly say it. So even if your job applications, the way you announce something, the way you put something in the bulletin, if you can just make sure you say we want men and women to apply for this role, or this role is open to men and women, no matter what your theology is, I can guarantee you, you will have people come out of the woodwork that you did not know were interested in leadership. They didn't know they could apply for these kinds of jobs. It will open up the dialogue. And then as you recruit people, make sure that you're expanding your own network and you aren't just looking for people a lot like you or looking for the guy that you would be the most comfortable having lunch with. You're actually challenging yourself to be inclusive of all the leaders that God has brought to your church.
Okay, well let's talk about that because I mean, I for years and years, I mean, the leadership development groups that I ran and led, it was all men. I mean, it really was. It was okay. I'm going to invite 12 men to meet with me for a year or 2 years, or we're going to do this adventure or whatever. Talk about that intentional discipleship or leadership development of women in ministry.
So one of the things that's uniquely different between men and women is men, as they're growing up, particularly in church spaces, tend to have a lot of leadership development and spiritual formation interwoven. So, like when you're saying, who can I develop as a leader? You're looking for young men because you're thinking like a disciple maker, but then you're
Yes.
also giving leadership development. And
Yes.
most of our discipleship experiences are gender based. Men disciple men, women disciple women. In women's spaces, spiritual formation and leadership development are not interrelated. They are very separate. So I might go to a women's ministry space or be discipled by a woman. I'm going to get a lot of spiritual formation thing, but I'm going to get almost no leadership development. If I want leadership development, really the only place for me is in my school or my marketplace. And so those things aren't interwoven. So when you're raising up leaders, when actually you're discipling someone, you're actually raising up a leader and you're looking at young men and saying, I see leadership in you. Again, we look at women and we're like, we see great wives in you, or you're going to be a great mom one day. We're not saying you're an amazing leader. And then we're putting them in environments where leadership development is not really integrated in. At the most, they might learn to be a discussion group facilitator at a table with a video teaching. So we're missing that. And so part of what we need to do is realize we need leaders like you, particularly our male leaders who have had this 20 or 30-year run of leadership development. We actually need you to develop women in leadership because there is no one to develop us in the church. There's a handful of people like me who can do it, but there's only a handful of us. And so if we don't get out of that gender-based mindset for leadership development and start crossing gender lines and realize we can develop giftedness across gender lines, you have to do it in certain ways. I'm certainly not naive to think that you can, take people to lunch and a conference and share whatever. I'm saying there's a way to go about it where we can maintain our professional guidelines that create safety for everyone, including you, by the way. These are protective
Yes.
for everybody. We can maintain all of those and actually develop an entire generation of women. And I'm telling you, if they've been sitting in a Bible study for 30 years, they are ready to use their leadership in the church and they're going to be amazing at it. Their window to grow into it is going to be so short compared to that 19-year-old guy out there. It's going to be amazing. You're going to get so much movement out of it by just a little leadership development intentionality.
And over the years, Katie, as I've shifted and as these different groups have shifted to be inclusive of men and women both, what you discover is there's a richness to that group that it was missing before. It just was. And it's not bad to develop men or all women on their own necessarily, but just to know you are missing a richness of the kingdom when you're only doing one or the other. There's an incredible beauty that happens in that diversity.
Yeah, and it's diversity of all kinds, right? Like if you only have 22-year-olds or you only have 65-year-olds, you're also missing how big and rich and beautiful and diverse the body of Christ is. And the reality is when it comes to spiritual formation and leadership development, both of these you can see in the research, affinity is very, very important in the early steps. So when someone is new to faith or an unbeliever or first comes to a church, They need to be able to see someone like them to know I can fit in here. Someone relates to my experience. But as you grow, you have to have diversity. Otherwise, you stall because all you have is one kind of monocular viewpoint of yourself or of God or of faith or of leadership. It's the diversity that actually catalyzes our growth. And so we aren't doing ourselves or anybody else any favors staying with people who are a lot like ourselves. All we do is kind of go in a circle. We actually want to grow. We have to move from affinity to diversity in all of our platforms. This is one of the ways we can do that.
Okay, let's talk to new church planters right now. Hundreds of them launching new churches in the United States this year, right? And then, but also let's talk to men like myself who are out there and they've been leading in a church for years, but they're listening to this and they're going, man, I even though they can't be senior pastors or elders or deacons or whatever in our church, there's lots of room for women to lead. Give us, how would you start out, Kadi? What's for the church planter, for that leader who just wants to start something? Give us some tips on what are some first steps for me to take.
So one of the best things that you can do wherever you're at in sort of your leadership or church journey is to take a look at the women around you and look for the leaders. So not every woman should be in leadership, just like not
Right.
every man should be in leadership.
That's
So
correct.
when you start thinking about this, it's not about getting women into leadership. It's about identifying female leaders and then figuring out what's their journey like. Where are they at? What is the next step that God has for them in their calling? Again, we don't lead, we serve, right? As ministry leaders, as pastors, it's your job to actually serve and open up environments for people to fulfill the calling God has put on their life for your local church. That's how this works. And so the first step you can do is identify the actual female leaders. You'll know them because they have followers, right? Followers that you would want more of. If they've got followers that you wish would leave the church, that's not the leader you're looking for. So be discriminate. This is not a ton of people. God does not give the gift of leadership to, 90% of your congregation. He gives it to about 10%. So look for the 10%, find the ones that are women, and then have a conversation with them and ask them, hey, what is it like to be a female leader here? What is it like to
Wow.
be a female leader under my leadership? Now, this is a very courageous question, but it's even more courageous if you actually listen to the answer. Don't deflect, don't defend, don't try to excuse away. Just listen. Listen to her experience. Learn from what she is offering you. Allow her to express her emotions if they're there. You may be the first person who's ever asked her this. That will teach you so much about how you're doing on this subject. Now, I will say if they only have positive things to say about you, I would be a little suspect. If they only have negative things to say about you, I would be a little suspect.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So interview at least a handful of them and look for the themes. Gosh, I didn't know anyone even thought of me as a leader. Or I've tried to sign up for a leadership role, but every time I get interviewed, I get turned down. Or I've volunteered 4 times, no one's called me back. Or I asked to be a teacher and instead they offered it to my husband. Or, the stories will make you cry of what women have experienced who are gifted and capable and assert themselves to try to lead in the church in the experience they have. So I will just warn you, there will probably be an opportunity for you to apologize for things you are not responsible for. Please take advantage of it. Women need to know that not everyone thinks of them the way other people have thought of them in the past. So do a pastoral moment, have a leadership moment, learn from it yourself, and then begin to make some changes. It's not hard to get female leaders to be on board with you. It's hard if you don't take time to listen and understand what's really going on. So that would be the first thing. The second thing is challenge yourself to think of the women in your life, particularly your own wife, as not gifted to complement your weaknesses, but gifted to fulfill her own calling. If you grew up in any sort of conservative environment, most of the framework around marriage and women, particularly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, was really oriented around women are gifted to complement their husband. But the way that got applied, particularly for pastors, is women were made to complement their husband's weaknesses. So I'm really unorganized. So my wife is super organized. Good thing God made her that way. And she's like, I would really like to not have to be the one with the list one day. Can someone else plan dinner? Right? Just because you can be organized does not mean that is your gift. In fact, the gift of administration in 1 Corinthians 12, Romans 12, like, isn't really being organized. That is a strategic leadership gift. I have the gift of administration. I can organize your next campus launch better than probably lots of people. That doesn't mean I want to like organize the silverware drawer or like make sure you have a lunch ready for tomorrow. So those are different gifts. I don't do my own calendar invites or take my own notes in meetings. That's a different thing than the gift of administration. So make sure in someone's love for you or desire to support you and the ability of women to adapt and flex to a need in the moment hasn't locked her or you into viewing her as your sidekick and she's magically gifted in ways you're bad at. Now, there's obviously compliments, and we do marry people who are good at things that we're not good at, but don't make assumptions. In fact, most of the men I see shifting their theology around this have a wife who is about done organizing her husband's life and is ready to use her gifts, which are not that. Or they have a daughter coming of age who's looking at her dad saying, Dad, I'm graduating from college with a ministry degree. I don't think I have a place at your church. And he's thinking, I did raise you to be a leader. Why do you not feel that way? What are we doing here that would make you think you're not welcome here? And it challenges not our theology. It challenges our practices. It challenges our assumptions. It challenges who we have in leadership and who we don't have in leadership. And those messages that we're sending to the women in our lives that are making them not actually live out everything that God has for the abundant life he gave to them.
Okay. So much to kind of digest and process, Kadi. I'm so grateful. You can connect with Kadi at www.kadicole.com. That's a website where you can go find out all kinds of different stuff about Kadi and her ministries. Kadi, you're involved right now. You're helping other churches with leadership development, I believe. Yes. So please, she has lots of resources, great books, her new book out again, Find Your Leadership Voice in 90 Days. Kadi, is that for both men and women, or is that predominantly for women?
Both men and women read it, but I did write it predominantly for women. Part of it is when Developing Female Leaders came out. I wrote that geared towards men who are trying to kind of understand this. And they started offering women a lot of opportunities to lead, but women were getting to those leadership roles and not really enjoying it or not sure how to navigate these higher level male populated environments. And so the Find Your Leadership Voice is really a way for women to figure out how to sit at those tables with confidence, stop questioning yourself, understand your calling, knowing when to speak and how to speak in a way that's honoring, but really honest and advocates for yourself. So a lot of practical how-tos. There's some video curriculum that goes along with it too that's really helpful if you want to do a small group of female leaders in your church.
Excellent. And Kadi, one of the things I've appreciated about our time together so much today is, Stadia works with both egalitarian and complementarian leaders. And I've just heard in your tone, in the words you've said, this is a secondary issue. It's not something we split a church over. It's not something we divide over.
Right.
But how do we develop females to the fullest of their potential and gifting in God and allow them to use that gifting?
That's right.
Kadi?
That's right. I am for local church. So yes, anything I can do to help, please reach out.
Kadi, thanks for your time. Thanks for being on the Church Planting Podcast.
Thank you, Greg, so much and all that you're doing.
Thanks for listening to the Church Planting Podcast. The Church Planting Podcast is part of the Stadia Podcast Network. To find more great episodes and to see how Stadia can help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation, be sure to check out stadia.org/podcasts.